All right. And without further ado, I am delighted to introduce Nathan Adamson, who will be teaching us about phonology and orthography today. So take it away, Nathan.
Thank you, Anna, and welcome. I'm so excited to be here and to see all of you participating, even though I don't see all of your faces. It's exciting to see where everyone's from here in the chat. Um, just by way of a little bit of introduction, like Anna mentioned, my name is Nathan Adamson. I am a linguist. I'm a PhD student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I'm also co-director of the Documentation Training Center. So if any of you attended last week's workshop with Olivia, she is my co-director. We work together in the Language Document Training Center, where we do lots of community language documentation training and help community members to start working on documenting their own languages. And so I'm really excited to get to share a little bit of my some of the things that I really enjoy about language documentation and working in phonology and orthography. And as always, if you have any questions, you're welcome to leave them in the chat, or we'll have some time a little bit after to answer some questions that you can ask me personally. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen here and make sure I do this right. Okay. All right. And go ahead and let me know if there are any problems, but I think we should be set. So today we're going to talk about phonology and orthography. And just a few of my objectives for our meeting today is I want to build your capacity in language documentation, conservation, and instruction for those of you who might be language teachers in these three main ways. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to understand a little bit more about the sounds of human language and the possibilities that exist in human language for sound systems. I hope we'll build some capacity in helping you be able to describe the sounds of human language. This is an imperative skill in documentation. How do you describe the sounds, and how would you be able to teach them to someone? How would you record them and write them down? And we'll also talk about writing systems and orthographies. It's a big word. We'll talk about what it means a little bit later. But this talking about this aspect of language documentation will help you learn how to write down your language, especially if your language doesn't have a standardized writing system or way that people normally write things. And if it already does, it will help you understand it better, maybe, and also maybe learn how some things might work better as we go forward in our language documentation projects. So to start off with just an overview of the sounds of human language. Language is incredibly fascinating, and there's so many possibilities for sounds in human language. As far as consonants goes, there are at least 225 possible consonants and probably many more. There's at least 39 simple vowels that we can make in human language, and definitely a lot more if we start looking at some fine details. And there's dozens of diphthongs, and a diphthong is just a moving vowel. So it might start as one vowel and kind of change into another one. And when we put all these together, human language is nearly endless in the possible combinations that we can have in sounds. And these are just the spoken languages of the world. If we look at the sign languages, we also find these similar combinations where we have things like hand position in sign language and orientation and shape of the hand. All of these things work essentially the same as sounds in human language. So studying sounds and documenting sounds is just an incredibly rewarding process, and it's a very big puzzle that we have to figure out in language documentation. So to kind of start breaking down human sounds so we can start documenting them, we have to talk about the two main types of human sounds. And most of you are probably familiar with consonants and vowels, but sometimes these are hard to describe. Think for a second, how would you describe a consonant to someone versus a vowel to someone? I'll give you, 10 seconds. Just think about it in your head for a second. What is the difference between these two?
Can I answer?
Sure, go ahead. What would you say your answer is?
A vowel, there's no obstruction,
Great.
and consonant there's an obstruction in the mouth, like some sort of obstruction.
Great. That was a perfect definition. If we look at consonants, these are the sounds that constrict or stop the airflow. So you talked about constriction or obstruction in the production of these sounds, and that's exactly correct. As opposed to vowels, these are sounds that seem to just shape the airflow, and there's less constriction. And so these are a lot more free flowing when we produce them. That's a perfect definition there. So I want you to just take a second, and you can do this in the chat or even on your own, but I want you to think of as many consonants and vowels that you can think of. So if you might do this in English, but you're also welcome to do this in any language that you may speak that's different than English. And I'd encourage you to do this in your own language. And to do this, what I want you to do first is just think of a word and think of the sounds that occur in that word and write the word down. And then think of a different word. We're trying to figure out sounds in context. So instead of just writing down a P, right, I want you to write down P with the word that it goes with, if that makes sense. This will help us to keep the sounds separate for a little bit while we're learning how to document them. So I want you to take 30 seconds and just list as many sounds as you can, consonants and vowels. If you don't speak another language other than English, you can do this in English as well. So I'm going to watch the chat and just see what kind of sounds you come up with here. Okay, we have some Armenian. Rich in consonants, yes. Yeah. Wow, yeah, that is a very interesting family name. Lots of consonants and lots of consonants together. Baklava. Interesting. All right, well, I'm going to let you take some more time and keep thinking of as many consonants and vowels as you can in your languages and writing them down. We're going to go through some of these in English. So if we look at the sounds of English, I've divided them in consonants and vowels, and these are just the very basic sounds. If we start digging a little bit deeper, we can find even more variation in the sounds. But the main basic sounds that we'll talk about later as being phonemes in English, you can see here, I've bolded usually the first letter is what I'm looking for, like pi, bi, my, Wi-Fi, vi, wi-tai, right? And these are just rhyming words. It's easy to figure out the sounds of a language this way that we'll talk about in a second. We look at vowels. We have bead, bid, bade, bed, bad, bod. To me, I say these the same, but some speakers of English say these different, bod versus bod. So there's so many sounds that are possible even just in English. If we look at outside of English, we get even more possibilities. And so when we're looking at all of these different types of sounds, we have to start to make some distinctions between different types of sounds that we might encounter when we're documenting our languages. So we have two different types of sounds that I'm going to talk about today. We have what are called phonemes and allophones. Phonemes are sounds that essentially make a difference in a word's meaning. So if we go back to my list of English words here, we have lots of words that rhyme, right? Pi, bi, my. These are sounds that only differ in, or these are words that only differ in one sound, but they're different words. They mean different things. That means that these different sounds are phonemes because they make a difference in the word's meaning. So that's a phoneme, a sound that makes a difference in the word's meaning. Allophones don't make a difference in the word's meaning. So these are a variety of a sound, a variety of a phoneme, you could say, that appears based on what environment it occurs in. So this could be a sound that changes slightly because it's next to another sound that influences it. This could also be maybe some sounds are pronounced one way at the beginning of the word, but are pronounced slightly differently at the end of a word. So I have an example here of the k sound. which we've represented here in English with the letter C or the letter CK, but it's the same sound. And in these three instances, this sound is actually pronounced in three different ways. So we have cat, scat, and stat. And these are, while they're very similar sounds, they're pronounced in slightly different ways. You can kind of tell this if you put your hand up to your mouth when you say cat. So you can try this on your side. If you say cat, you should be able to feel the puff of air that comes out of your mouth when you pronounce cat. But when you do this, when you put your hand up to your mouth, when you pronounce scat or stack, you probably don't feel as much or any air that's coming out of your mouth. Scat versus stack. So this is already a sign that these are pronounced slightly differently, even though we might think of them as being the same sound. These are allophones. If we were to say the word cat without that puff of air, we would still understand each other and know what we're saying the word cat. So you could say cat or cat, and it's still the same word, although it might sound slightly odd because we're not pronouncing it exactly how a native speaker would pronounce it. But there's no difference in the meaning. And so these types of sounds that change slightly based on the environment are called allophones. So there we have it. Two different types of sounds, phonemes and allophones, depending on what kind of difference they make. So we talked about how in English, that puff of air doesn't make a difference in the meaning, but that's not true for all languages. If we look at Cantonese, for example, this puff of air, which I've represented here by this little H that you put behind the K and kind of above it, this is very important in Cantonese and is a way that we distinguish some different words. So I do have some recordings here that can kind of demonstrate this example. So we have cup, which is fingernail, versus cup, which means to suck in Cantonese. I'm going to play these recordings for you. I hope you should be able to hear it on your end, hopefully. So let's see.
Gap. Cup.
So you can kind of hear there's a slight difference, enough to be able to tell the difference, but these are actually different words. So the types of sound differences in the world's languages are different. So in some languages like English, this puff of air is not important to making a difference. In some languages like Cantonese, it does make a very big difference and is more of a phoneme instead of the allophone. So just be aware that individual languages will differ in what kinds of sounds constitute phonemes versus allophones. So how do we even go about starting to document the sounds of a language and figure out what sounds make a difference and what sounds don't make a difference? One of the best ways to start is by looking for what we call minimal pairs. Minimal pairs, we've already seen some today, are two real and different words that only differ in one sound with no added sounds. These tell us what the phonemes of a language are. So remember, phonemes make a difference in meaning. So if we look at lots of rhyming words, many rhyming words are minimal pairs. We're looking for a word that only has one sound different, but is still a different word. So if we look at pot, a minimal pair for pot is bot. We have the same vowel sound and the same final consonant sound. The only sound that differs is the very first sound. And even if we just change this one sound, it makes a new word. So these are minimal pairs. And this means that P and B are separate phonemes in English in this language. Same with spot versus snot. So we have all of the sounds that are the same except for just one. So we have the P versus the N. And this means, again, that P and N in English are different phonemes. So these are sounds that make a difference in the meaning in English. Here are some bad examples that aren't minimal pairs. So we have pot versus spot. While these are very similar, they have three of the exact same sounds. These are not minimal pairs because one word has three sounds and one word has four sounds. We don't want to have any added sounds in minimal pairs. Also, this next one, spot versus snog. These are also not minimal pairs, even though they're very similar. They have two similar sounds, and both of them have four sounds, but these differ in two sounds. So the P and the N are different, and the T and the G are different. So these would not be considered completely minimal pairs. So when we're looking for minimal pairs, again, we want it to be exactly the same except for one single sound. But we also have to be careful. We don't just have to look at letters in looking for minimal pairs. We should also look at things like tone, if your languages have tone. So this is an example from Mandarin Chinese, where we have minimal pairs that are only differ based on the tone that they are pronounced with, right? So here we have 5 different words. We have ma, 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 ma. And these are all different words that are only, that we can tell they're different by the way they're pronounced with the tone. So it's fun. We can make a fun sentence out of this. Mother hemp scolded the horse. We can say, or ma, 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 right? And did Mother hemp scold the horse? It's very interesting to work with tonal languages like this. And languages also differ in the amount of tones they have. Some, like Mandarin, have 4 or 5. We have Cantonese with 6. But many languages also just have 1 or 2 tones, where we have maybe a high tone and a low tone. So when you're thinking about minimal pairs, also think about tone. Okay, so we're going to take a second and give you some time to think about minimal pairs in your languages. If you don't speak a language other than English, you can work through English. If not, think about your language and see if you can think of a minimal pair or 2 and drop it in the chat. Tell us what language you're working with and what minimal pair that you've uncovered. We'll give you a minute or 2 to kind of think through this for a second. Okay, we have some Spanish. Bota versus bota. Interesting, yeah. So we have boot versus boat. Give versus door in Armenian. Lalpat. Good. Great. These are great examples of minimal pairs. Oh, some interesting ones. Portuguese, Urdu, Punjabi, Catalan. Great. Awesome. So remember, are these contrasting sounds phonemes or allophones when we're looking at minimal pairs? Remember, if it makes a difference in the meaning, it's a phoneme. So when we're coming up with minimal pairs, these are phonemes that we're finding. So now let's take a second and think about these minimal pairs that you've come up with. Can you think about those sounds that are contrasting? And can you think, is this sound pronounced in any different way in my language? So these are oftentimes very hard to think about on your own, especially as a native speaker. If you're used to speaking this language, you might not even recognize that you pronounce it slightly differently in a different scenario. But think for a second. If I say this at the beginning of the word or the end of the word, or maybe in the middle of the word, do I pronounce this slightly differently? Or you can think about when I put this other sound next to this sound that I'm thinking about, do I pronounce this differently? And you might have to listen very carefully to how you're saying things. And you might use tricks like we did before. You might put your hand up to your mouth and see, okay, how much air is coming out of my mouth. Or you might also record yourself and listen back. Pay attention to where your tongue is as well. Is it slightly higher or lower or farther back when I say this in this environment versus this environment? And these are ways that you might start to discover some of the allophones in your language. So if you have some idea, you can drop some of these allophones in the chat as well. Ways that you might pronounce a single sound in your language differently. Remember, the important thing about allophones is that they don't matter to the meaning. So if you were to pronounce a word wrong per se, and used the wrong version of a certain sound, most speakers would still be able to understand you. Okay, so now that we have a basis for sounds, documenting sounds in a language, we know what phonemes and allophones are, consonants and vowels. Now we need to start going out and doing it. But the problem, one of the big problems is how do we represent sounds? Especially because this is very important. Letters do not equal sounds. Here's a fun example. These are, this is a fun meme that I found online where we have several different words in English that are spelled almost exactly the same, but are pronounced very differently. And then we have two words at the end that are pronounced almost the same, but are very different in spelling. So we have cough, rough, through, though, and these four words don't rhyme, but somehow pony and baloney rhyme in English. If this doesn't illustrate my point here, that letters do not equal sounds in writing, I don't know what does. But it can be frustrating when we're documenting a language or we're reading something that has been documented by someone and we don't know how to pronounce the words because letters oftentimes don't equal sound in writing. When we're documenting sounds in English alone, our alphabet only has 26 letters. And in these 26 letters, we have 21 consonants and 5 vowels. But the sound system of English is so much bigger than the alphabet of English. We have at least 40 sounds in English. And so how do we represent all of these sounds with such a finite set of letters? So this becomes a very difficult problem in language documentation very quickly, especially when we're working with languages that have so many sounds and so many phonemes and allophones that might differ just based on slight different environments in the language. So what do we do? Before we get there though, let's do some examples. And just in English, I want you to put your answers in the chat. We have 3 letters here, G, F, and C. I want you to think of words in which these letters are pronounced in different ways. How many sounds can these 3 letters make? Let's see what you come up with really quick. So I'll put a first example here. We have, oh, great. Okay, we already have some examples coming in. Goat, cough versus great. Yep. George is like a j sound. Smog, ghost, leg. Giraffe, you have the different pronunciation of G. Good. Garage, that's a good one with the j sound. Girl and Joe. Great. So you can already see just in your experience with English that at least the letter G and I'll show you with F and C as well. These letters are pronounced in so many different ways. They have so many different sounds that they represent. Here's some examples that I came up with. For G, we have girl, so the g sound. We have giraffe, so the j. We have garage, so this j kind of sound. And we have though, which is really no sound. F, we have off versus of. You can kind of hear the difference very slightly, off versus of, right? One of the ways you can feel the difference very easily is if you put your hand on your throat when you pronounce these different types of Fs. So off versus you should be able to feel your throat vibrating when you say of, but not vibrating when you say off. So this is another just very slight difference in the sound, that the same letter is used for both sounds, but they're very different. In the letter C, we have cello, celery, can, czar, champagne, right? So these letters are used in English to represent very different sounds. And so if we're just using normal English writing conventions to document a language, it's going to be very confusing very quickly what sounds we're actually trying to record and document. On the flip side, we can spell a single sound in English in many different ways. So this sound, I've represented it here with this symbol. It's the sh, like the SH sound in English. But we can spell this in many different ways with an SH, a CH, right? SSI, mission, elation, ocean, shilling, sugar, tissue, special. all of these words have the same exact sound in it, but they're spelled in completely different ways. So again, this is very frustrating in language documentation when we're working with very complex and very detailed sounds that we want to record very accurately. So sounds versus letters, just a summary. A sound is not the same as a letter. Sounds are heard, first of all, letters are written. One sound may correspond to two or more letters, and one letter may correspond to two or more sounds, right? So we get all these kinds of problems in recording sounds. We're going to jump ahead here for a little bit. And here's just a final insight that I don't know, insight joke. If according to the spelling rules of English, right, if we have the sound in enough spelled as GH, the O in woman makes the I sound, the TI in nation pronounced as sh, then the word GHOTI could hypothetically be pronounced just the same as the word fish in English, according to the same spelling conventions. So welcome to English spelling. It's very confusing. So what do we do about it? In language documentation, it's very important to be very accurate so that people who are trying to learn the language and trying to help us with the documentation can understand exactly what sounds we're meaning when we write them down. So what linguists use is we use what's called the International Phonetic Alphabet, or the IPA. The IPA is just a consistent way of representing sounds in language in a one-to-one relationship. So one symbol has one sound, and that's it. The IPA can be difficult to learn, especially initially, and it takes a little bit of getting used to. You can kind of think about it as being similar to musical notation. If you're not trained in musical notation and you look at a sheet of music, you might not know anything that's going on, and you might not be able to understand anything. But with just a few simple trainings, you can learn the IPA fairly quickly and be able to use it in your documentation. The IPA is very good because it's based on actually the physics of producing sound. So here's a chart of the main symbols of the IPA, and you can kind of see they're organized very in an organized way based on where the sounds are pronounced in your mouth and how they're pronounced. So if you see across the top of this chart, we have a lot of big words that correspond to where in the mouth your tongue is touching or when you pronounce the word. So first of all, we have this bilabial. This means that you're using two lips to pronounce the sound, like p or b. We have labiodental, meaning you're using one lip and your teeth. So like f or v, you can see down here. And as we go back in the chart, we're also going back in the mouth. So the areas where these words are pronounced or these sounds are pronounced correspond to a specific place in the mouth where these sounds are produced. So that's across the top. These are the places of articulation. Across the side here, these are what we call the manners of articulation, or how the sounds are pronounced. So we have different types like a plosive, a nasal, a trill, a fricative, and these are just different ways we might pronounce a sound. So if we take, for example, a plosive, sometimes these are also called stops. We have the plosive T and D. You can kind of think these plosive as exploding sounds. They stop the air and then it kind of explodes like t, duh, right? If we go down to here, this is a fricative. This kind of sounds like the word friction, right? Because that's exactly what's happening in your mouth when you pronounce these sounds. There's some friction of air in your vocal tract. So instead of like a t and a duh, which is a hard stop in the sound, we might have an S or a Z sound, where you can hear the friction of the air going through your mouth. So we have many different types of articulations or pronunciations, you might call them, that we can encode here in this chart that help us to remember the IPA and to learn it quickly. It also helps us in describing languages that we might not be familiar with. So again, this looks pretty complicated at first. There are lots of resources online to help you learn the IPA and to learn to transcribe it. But it usually doesn't take too long to get a pretty good handle on the IPA. So we looked at the consonants of IPA. These are also the vowels of IPA. And the vowels are organized based similar to the consonants where they're pronounced. So we have along the left side here, how open or closed your mouth is when you pronounce these vowels. So we have a sound like ah, which is a very open sound. Your jaw might even drop when you say ah, versus the sound e, which is a very closed mouth sound. We also have along the top where the tongue is in your mouth when you pronounce these vowels. So it might be in the front of the mouth, like e, or it can go all the way to the back, as in ooh, right? And so if you pay attention, when you're saying the vowel sounds of your language, you might notice these differences in where they're pronounced. And that's how we classify vowels. There's one more way we classify vowels, and that is according to the lips, what the lips are doing when we're pronouncing these vowels. So for example, we have these two vowels that are both closed mouth sounds, but at the front of the mouth. The only difference between these two is what we call rounding. So this is what happens to your lips when you say these sounds. So E, we have an E. We can say this with a spread mouth. We don't have to do anything special with our lips. E. But this symbol right here represents the sound E. So you can see the difference even in my lips. If you can see my video, we have E versus E. So you can see the difference between these sounds is just what happens with my lips. My lips are rounded in the pronunciation of E versus E. And so in this IPA chart of the vowels, the symbol on the left side is an unrounded version, whereas the symbol on the right side is the rounded version. So I'm interested in some of the sounds that your languages might have. Do you recognize any of these sounds, especially maybe this E sound? This is pretty common in lots of languages of the world. Take a second and think about some of the sounds that exist in your language, and think about where these are pronounced. They might be a consonant, so you can think about, okay, is it in the front? Is it behind my teeth? Is it kind of farther back near what we call the velum? And there's lots of words that you might not understand at first with the IPA, but you can at least start trying to think about describing the sounds based on where they're pronounced in your own languages. Here's just a quick video of an MRI of someone pronouncing different vowels, and you can see how much the tongue is moving in these different pronunciations. So take a look here. Good. So you should be able to see in this video the tongue moving both forward and back, up and down, and also the lips, which sometimes round, especially in the ooh sound, versus some of the other sounds. All right, oops, I need to play that again. Let's go on. So when we're describing a language and documenting a language, we want to focus on the sounds rather than the letters that we might be used to writing. And this is very important because it helps us avoid lots of problems in the documentation of a language. So first of all, the IPA helps us to represent sounds that don't fit well in the spelling system of our languages. Additionally, we can avoid issues in irregular spellings. So we look at these words in English like sees, and sees. These are pronounced exactly the same, but they're spelled all differently. We can also use the IPA to transcribe words that we've never heard before and we don't know what they mean. You can't do that very well using writing systems in, for example, English. If you don't know how a word is spelled, or if you're not familiar with a word, you might not be able to spell it correctly on the first try. So if we're using the IPA, we can hear a new word like this word right here, gabori satse. And we would be able to write it down just based on the sounds. And someone who had never heard that word before could read our IPA transcription and pronounce it exactly correct. So using IPA is a great first step, and learning the IPA is a great first step to starting to document the sounds of a language. If you're interested in learning the IPA, you can find some great resources online. Here's one of these resources. It's an interactive IPA chart, so you can click on the symbol and hear someone pronounce the sound. And this can help you, especially as you're starting to document languages. You're not quite sure how to represent this sound. You can kind of hear someone else pronounce it for you and make sure you're using the correct symbols. Okay, so now that we've got a handle on how to start documenting sounds, we also should talk about orthography, the word orthography and writing systems. So while the IPA is very useful in documenting the sounds of a language, it has some drawbacks when it comes to writing. Sometimes some of the symbols in IPA are very detailed and they're very hard to type on a keyboard. And most people aren't very used to using the IPA. And so it's not a very good system to use in everyday writing, for example. Additionally, lots of languages already have set writing systems. And so it's hard to reinvent the wheel completely and start making speakers use the IPA if they want to write their language down. And so usually what languages have is what's called a writing system or an orthography. And a writing system is just a way to represent language on paper, right? To write something down. And this becomes an orthography when it becomes attached to a specific language. So when there are some systems about it or it's standardized, this is what we call an orthography. And why is it important to have an orthography? There are many reasons why it's important. First of all, this can create cohesion within a language community, especially in endangered language communities that may not be used to writing their language down. When the communities come together and start to be able to write their language, this creates a very strong sense of community, and they can rally around this new way of representing their own language. Additionally, this helps to increase the prestige that surrounds a language. Lots of languages that are unwritten are considered to be lesser, which is unfortunate, right? And it's not true at all about language. But in the eyes of speakers, even, sometimes if your language doesn't have a way to be written down, it's seen as to be a lesser or even more barbaric language, which is very unfortunate and very inaccurate. So once we develop an orthography for a language, lots of times the prestige of this language in the speaker's eyes is elevated. Also, when we have a writing system, this can help to adapt this language to be used in schools. And it's just important to be able to write down language. It's a very useful skill to have. And so we want to develop an orthography once we have an understanding of the sound system of a language. There are many different types of orthographies. We have three main types that I'll talk about quickly. We have logographic systems, syllabaries, and alphabets. Logographic systems are logos or pictures. And so this is where we have one symbol that corresponds to one meaning, morpheme, word, whatever you want to call it. But we have one symbol that represents one meaning. So these aren't like alphabets where the symbols represent sounds. Here, symbols represent meanings. So a great example of a logographic system that's still in use today is Chinese, standard Chinese, where we have symbols that represent words. So you can kind of see some examples here. So this word is pronounced ko, but there's nothing about this symbol that makes it look like how it's pronounced, right? We just have to memorize that this symbol means this word. The next type of writing system is called a syllabary. A syllabary is one symbol per syllable. So usually this is like a consonant and a vowel pairing together. This is Japanese. The hiragana and katakana systems of Japanese are syllabaries, where we have, for example, here we have ba, te, bi, bo, bu. And each of these syllables has a different symbol. This type of writing system usually works well for languages that have simple syllables and not lots of consonant clusters. The final type of writing system or orthography we'll talk about is an alphabet. And alphabet is what English uses. And the basic principle of an alphabet is that there's one symbol for every sound or for every phoneme in a language. Of course, there are exceptions, as we've already seen in English, that alphabets usually can't capture the extent of variation. And in fact, all writing systems have a very difficult time capturing the extent of variation in sounds of a language. But alphabets try to do this, where they try and make one symbol represent a sound. There's many different types of alphabets across the world. So English, we use the Roman alphabet, but we also have the Greek alphabet or the Cyrillic alphabet used in many Slavic languages. And so these are three main types of alphabet or writing systems that you might consider in developing an orthography for the languages that you work with. Some things to consider as you develop an orthography for the language you are working with is oftentimes speakers already have developed some sort of writing system, and it may be more helpful to adapt what they already have instead of newly invent the wheel. It's also possible to develop what's called a working orthography. That means, it's not quite accurate yet, and it might be more related to the sounds of a language. It's just a work in progress, and it might not be official at this point, but we're just trying to develop something to help us represent the sounds of a language. And some final tips to keep in mind is, again, as much as we can represent sounds with our writing system, the better. So one sound to one symbol is best. And you might think about how this writing system and orthography might be used. So if you come up with completely new symbols for the language that you're working with, although that might be very accurate for your language, think about how this would be adapted to computers and cell phones. This would take a very long time and take a lot of work to get these symbols into a digital format. And so usually trying to think about this usages of the orthography is very important. Also, be sure to involve your community members and get their feedback on what is important to them in the orthography and how they might use this as well. So thank you again for having me out today. This is Thank You in IPA. I'm excited again to see everyone who's interested in language documentation and working on especially sound systems of languages. And thank you for attending today. Again, if you have any questions, I think we have some time here that you can ask me questions. You can drop them in the chat. I'll try and see them, and Anna will help me kind of monitor here. But you're also welcome to take the next few minutes and just ask me questions that you might have. Anna, did you have anything to add there?
No, thanks, Nathan. That was fantastic. I have sent some questions to you in the chat just now.
All right, here we go. Let me look at them here. Okay, question. Does the IPA cover tones? I always struggle with those. Is there any linguistic... maybe I'll start with this first question with tones. Yes, the IPA does cover tones. So there are several different ways in the IPA to represent tones. Let me just actually pull up a chart right here that I can kind of show you right off the bat of a way to represent tones. So I keep opening the wrong chart. I am going to just open it here. I have it bookmarked on my side.
That's how you know you're a real linguist, when you've got IPA charts bookmarked on your computer.
Yes. Okay. Oh, and I also have to share my screen again. That's why you can't see it. Okay. So here's one of those interactive IPA charts that here it is, that I mentioned earlier. So we have the IPA charts down here. But if we scroll down, there's this section down here in the bottom right that represents tone. And so we have these symbols that represent high tones, low tones, and also contour tones, which are tones that might be rising or falling. And we can often represent these with these diacritics that go over a vowel, or just with this symbol that we place at the end of a word usually. Many linguists also use numbers to represent tone that you might see, like a 1-1 usually means a high tone, whereas a 1-5 means high to low, right? So there are conventions within the IPA to represent tone. That's a great question. The second question, is there any linguistic reason or justification for one type of orthography, which is more important and useful than others? Good. So there are some justifications. And we mentioned a couple of them. One of the biggest justifications for which orthography you used is what the community is already used to. So for example, logographic systems like Chinese are very difficult to learn. However, with such a rich tradition in Chinese-speaking areas of using logographic systems, most speakers of languages related to Chinese languages still use logographic systems, even when they're obviously not the greatest for representing sounds. However, the speakers are used to them and they like them. And so this is a great way to do it. So lots of that is a big issue in choosing what type of orthography or writing system you use. But we also should look at the linguistic features of a language as well. So for example, syllabaries work very well with languages with very simple syllable structures. So Japanese, it works very well. There's not a lot of consonant clusters where an alphabet might be better at representing how all these sounds go together. But if we have a limited number of syllables in a language, a syllabary might be the best option. This was the case in the Cherokee language here in the United States. When they were trying to decide what orthography we should use, an alphabet or something that already exists, looking at the linguistic features of the language, they decided, this language actually works very well for a syllabary, and they created their own syllabary. So just, again, looking at what speakers are used to, what's easy to represent and use, and also some of the linguistic features are important in selecting a writing system. Okay, let's see. What do you mean by working orthography? So that's a great question. I'm actually going to drop a document in the chat here for you all. Let's see if I can do this. I was going to do this earlier and forgot, but this is a great question and will help here. Okay, so I've just dropped a PDF into the chat, and there's lots of the information on here that I covered today, and also a little bit more about working orthographies. So again, a working orthography, think of it as a work in progress, where you might not have developed a complete writing system for your entire language, and it's also not really the IPA. Really, a working orthography is something that you're using to represent the sounds and to represent the language, although it might not be official at this point. Lots of times working orthographies can develop into official orthographies, but a working orthography, again, is something that you might come up with yourself to represent a language while you're trying to figure some things out. So that might be the best way to think about a working orthography at this point. All right. Here's some questions. How can you work around holes in an existing orthography? Oh, great question. So, as we've seen in English, there are many, many holes in most, if not all, orthographies across the languages of the world, because orthographies often value different things than systems like the IPA, for example. Orthographies are very difficult to change as well, especially in communities and cultures that have a long tradition of writing. For example, if we wanted to reform the English system or the English orthography, it would be very difficult because of how long of a tradition we have been writing English in. So even though the English spelling system is inaccurate today for this kind of sounds that we pronounce mostly, we still use it out of tradition, and it's very hard to change. So one of the ways to work around the holes is to, first of all, we need to identify those holes. Are those holes areas probably sound to meaning or sound to symbol correspondences. So this sound isn't really represented well by this symbol. Is it a difficulty to these language speakers to use? And if so, if it is a big enough of a problem, you might want to consider an orthography reform and trying to go back in and redevise an orthography. If not, you might just try and with new conventions that you might add to an orthography, or when you need to use the IPA to represent things. So for example, you might use what's called a digraph to cover a hole in an orthography. So a digraph is when we have two letters that make a single sound. So like the SH in English. So we don't have a great symbol in the English spelling system to represent the sh sound, and so we use two letters. So this is just one example of a way you might cover a hole in orthography. But again, it's very dependent on the context. Okay, can the IPA system be used to address different regional accents of one language? Yes, 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 yes. And this is very important in linguistic studies that focus on regional varieties or dialects of a language. So lots of dialects are essentially differ based on pronunciation. And so IPA is essential in describing these different types of dialects. So we can use different vowels that characterize the different dialects. We can also use different consonants or what we call diacritics in the IPA. And these are just very slight variations to how we might pronounce something, whether it might have an extra burst of air like we talked about earlier, or it might be more nasalized, so there's air coming through your nose as well as your mouth when you pronounce it. And we can represent all these very fine details in the IPA. So yes. How do you think phonemic long vowels should be represented in orthography? By doubling the letters? That's a very good question. In some languages of the world, if you're not familiar, vowels, the length that a vowel is pronounced with is important to the meaning. So we talked about phonemes as making a difference in the meaning, and versus an right, might be a meaningful difference in some languages. And there are many different ways that languages across the world represent phonemic long vowels. English has them, but we don't represent them. English has long versus short vowels. They're not quite phonemic, but we don't represent them in the spelling system. And that is the case in lots of languages. However, I do find personally that representing them is very useful, and doubling letters does seem to be a very good way to represent these vowels, is using two vowels to represent a single long vowel. Another way to represent it, and you've probably seen this as well, is to use a little diacritic above the vowel. Usually it's like a flat line above the vowel. And this is common in languages like Hawaiian that uses that as well. So there's a few ways to do this in orthography. Again, just looking at what is practical, what speakers like, and those are some things you might consider. Okay. All right. How do I identify the complete range of sounds in a language? Are there standard set of words? Yes, there are. Good. And I can send this again to everyone. I'll put a document here in the chat. Just really quick, and I'm not going to send it to Anna this time. I accidentally sent that last time. Here's a good place to start. So I've sent a document in the chat. This is called a Swadesh list. So a Swadesh list, there are many different types of Swadesh lists. They're named after Morris Swadesh, who developed these types of lists. And these are what we call basic vocabulary lists. So we use these in our language documentation to start getting just a good list of words, and also to start get a handle on the sound system of a language. So these are basic vocabulary lists that are believed to be fairly universal across the languages of the world. So they cover very universal topics in languages like body parts and relationships and water, things that every culture presumably has. And so that most languages should have a word for these things. These are a great place to start your documentation projects and looking at sound systems. So there are different lengths of Swadesh lists. So I think the one I sent here is just over 100 words. There are some that are 200. And you can also look at, there are many word lists online, and you can go into looking at what we call semantic domains. So looking at words based on meaning. So you might look at, try and get all the words, tell me all the words you can think of about water, or all the words you can think of about food. And starting to get a large list of words. Once you have a large list of words, you can start analyzing the sounds and saying, okay, these are all the sounds that I can come up with. And you might even ask speakers, can you think of any more sounds? That I have these ones, can you think of any more? Or you might say, can you think of any words that rhyme with this word? And that's a way to start getting minimal pairs as well as in your documentation projects. But yes, using word lists is a great way to start. Okay. Do you think that orthography has a cultural, political, and identity issues or influences of a particular community? If so, in what way? Great question. I do think that orthography does have a large influence on a community. And some of these are maybe more obvious. So you talk about influences on the identity. I think that our language, and not just orthographies, but language plays a very big role in our personal identities and us constructing our identity of who we are in the world. And writing systems, for most speakers of languages, are very tied to their language. And so I think that is has a very big influence on your identity. And the different types of orthographies, I think, have influences as well. So if we look at logographic systems, for example, I know in my personal study of Chinese languages and Chinese linguistics, the way that speakers talk about language is definitely influenced by their writing system. They talk about, instead of talking about sounds lots of times they talk about these, well, it's pronounced the same way as the way this is pronounced, this character is pronounced, or it's the same character as in this word, right? And so I think there is definitely influences that orthographies have on speakers, and there's many different ways. I'm probably not the expert on this, but I do think yes. Okay, let's see.
Don't see any other questions in the chat. So if anyone has additional questions, now's the time.
Here's one. What's the precise function of a semantic domain? Good. A semantic domain is just a group of words that are related to each other in meaning. So like what I was saying before with words that are related, words that have to do with water, or words that are about plants. These are words that belong in a semantic domain. We use semantic domains to help document lots of the vocabulary of a language and the sound system of a language, because these are very easy go-to lists, you might say, to help you think of words. And these are usually help speakers to think of more words to give you. So you can say, what words have to do with water? And they keep spouting them out, right? And these words might remind you of another word. And so that's usually what we use semantic domains in when we talk about the function of semantic domains in documentation. Any other questions? What's a credible number for writing systems in the world? Say we put the number of languages around 7,000. What about writing systems? Okay. I can answer this question, but not off the top of my head. I know I have it. Just look really quick. In my preparation for today, I did look over some of the things that I had worked on before, and I can show you a couple things. Again, I'm not an expert by any means on writing systems, so take what I have to say with a little grain of salt. But here is some of what I have learned and researched. Let me just, I'll share my screen one more time here. Zoom. There it is. Okay. So just some, if you're interested in writing systems, yeah, if we put the number of languages in the world at about 7,000, about 4,000 of them have a written form that, they might have an orthography that's standardized in some way. This information is from Omniglot, I should mention. And Omniglot has, Omniglot cites 34 different writing systems currently in the use across the world today. And literacy rate globally of people aged 15 and older as 86.3%. So again, these statistics are from Omniglot, and that's about what we put here. However, the vast majority of the world's languages use just a very few writing systems. So here's just a little map here. We can see that everything here in this kind of teal green color uses the Latin alphabet, right? And so while there are about 34 different types of writing systems, most of the languages and areas of the world tend to use just a handful of these writing systems. Okay,
They're
is there
great
any?
questions, folks.
Yeah,
Any others?
It looks like this question was in the chat. Is there any language with two different writing systems? And it looks like some of my friends here have helped me answer. But so yes, there are. Even Japanese uses different writing systems in different scenarios. So yes, and lots of languages have even switched writing systems over time. And so there's kind of this fade, but well, very interesting.
Yeah, this question of multiple writing systems and how that relates to identity and politics and social structures is really complicated. Sometimes it says a lot about sort of which groups you identify with based on which writing system you choose to use. So there's a lot of complexity there.
That's very, very so. Interesting. So, Stirama, I have a trigram that represents an aspirated nasalized consonant, N, NYH. It causes readers to be baffled. Should I just accept it? This is a question again about developing your writing system in orthography. So we have three letters that represents a single sound, and we already saw in English 2 letters representing a single sound can be confusing. So yeah, this can be definitely confusing. And I think if you're trying to make a decision on what to accept into your orthography, there's no yes or no, one right way or one wrong way when you're thinking about this, but you should consider a few things. So first of all, come up with some options, right? Can you think of any other way that you might represent the sound? Is it different when you just have the NH, right? So if it's an aspirated nasalized consonant or something. Or, if you can think of other ways to represent the sound, this might help you to have some other options to think about. And also, again, you might think about adding diacritics like an accent mark, or maybe lots of times in nasalization we use, like in Portuguese, they use the tilde. And we use that in the IPA as well. So there are some ways to represent these without adding letters. We can just add maybe little symbols on the top or on the bottom of a letter. So my suggestion here is to come up with all your options and then test them with speakers and say, okay, what do the speakers like and what do the readers like? Are they baffled more by these trigrams or trigraphs, or by these symbols here? And again, you want to think about things like accessibility. How easy are these to write or type? How is it how accurate is it in representing the sounds, things like that. So I'm sorry I don't have a great answer without knowing your language a little bit better, but I hope that provides some direction to where to start.
Yeah, I will. I'll also share in the Google Drive a resource that one of the ELP interns made about some of the challenges that you might face when you're developing or trying to promote writing systems for Indigenous languages. So that'll be a little bit more to reflect on. And I'm going to call this last call for questions so that Nathan can get to his classes and whatever else he needs to do today. Oh, good question. Nathan, are you open to hearing from folks if they have more questions?
Yes, definitely. So I will put my email here in the chat. Um, let's see. I would love to hear any of your thoughts or questions that you had about today or things that you're working on as you're going forward in your language projects. So you're welcome to contact me. And I look forward to hearing from
you. All right. Well, let's give a big round of applause. Nathan, this was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you
And
all.
next week, we're going to get into some more exciting grammar stuff when we talk about morphology and syntax. So we'll think about how to put words together and how to put sentences together and how we can document that. All right, everybody. Hope you all have a wonderful week. Thanks again, Nathan. This was fantastic. And we'll see you all next week.
Thank you all.